For Arthur Schopenhauer, life is fundamentally disappointing because it is spent in pursuit of desires that never bring fulfillment, only momentary satiety. All existence is just the blindly striving will, and our represented world of the senses is premised on a false division of this will into individual things that then entice us to continue in our existence. Therefore, rather than seek after happiness, we should instead recognize the search for happiness as a kind of delusion and aspire instead for a heroic existence. We ought to struggle to negate our own will, to let go of our desires, and strive for a state of being akin to the Buddhist nirvana. Famously, Schopenhauer wrote, quote, "A happy life is impossible. The highest thing that man can aspire to is a heroic life, such as a man lives who is always fighting against unequal odds for the good of others, and wins in the end without any thanks. His will that has been mortified all his life by toiling and struggling, by evil payment and ingratitude, is absorbed into nirvana." End quote. Nevertheless, Schopenhauer also wrote a short work called The Wisdom of Life, in which he attempts to answer the question of how one could pursue happiness, supposing that it were possible. In this work, he fully admits that he's rejected the possibility of finding a happy existence through the ordering of one's life. Quote, "Now, whether human life corresponds or could possibly correspond to this conception of existence is a question to which, as is well known, my philosophical system returns a negative answer. In elaborating the scheme of a happy existence, I have had to make a complete surrender of the higher metaphysical and ethical standpoint to which my own theories lead, and everything I shall say here will to some extent rest upon a compromise. Insofar, that is, as I take the common standpoint of every day and embrace the error which is at the bottom of it." End quote. If the best thing for man is to negate life, then non-existence is preferable to existence, and the search for happiness would be meaningless. The compromise that Schopenhauer makes in The Wisdom of Life is with the common-sense proposition that existence is preferable to non-existence. Schopenhauer takes it as true for the sake of argument that existence can be, at least in some cases, worthwhile. And within this compromise, he writes on the topic of how a happy life could be attained. The Wisdom of Life is not the work that concerns us here, however. I've brought it up only to show by analogy how we could understand the text we're revisiting today in this installment of the Ubermodernism series. In a previous video, I went into great detail on Schopenhauer's views of discourse as put forward in The Art of Being Right. Schopenhauer doesn't think that logic, the intellectual pursuit of truth, can have any substantial involvement in the art of dialectic, debate between two or more individuals. Schopenhauer gives a number of reasons for why this is. Human nature is basically vicious and prideful. Interlocutors in a dispute cannot be expected to admit when they are wrong or to advance their arguments in good faith, or to adequately evaluate the arguments of their opponent, because these actions require a moral commitment to uphold the truth over one's own personal advantage. Furthermore, as human beings are fallible and ignorant, none of us really know what the truth is before we engage in a dispute. Schopenhauer quotes Democritus, "Truth is in the depths. It is obscure and difficult to grasp, and can only be approached by the committed, solitary intellect. That is to say, by thinking, and not by debate." Schopenhauer argues that when it comes to thinking, there is no instruction manual, no special art. Perhaps most importantly, debate itself is part of that delusion of the possibility of finding happiness in this phenomenal existence. Winning debates helps one increase his intellectual stature or reputation, perhaps win a public office, advance one's career, or perhaps you will even win a political majority for your party and make the world a better place. We might think of the high idealism of Socrates, that through dialogue one can even morally instruct others and make them into virtuous people. Socrates had his own theory of happiness, by the way, his own eudaimonology. A happy life is a virtuous life. The Socratic valuation of philosophical dialogue is therefore directly connected to the Socratic pursuit of happiness. Just as Schopenhauer's rejection of the value of dialogue is also connected to his own rejection of the pursuit of eudaimonia. But just as Schopenhauer is able to compromise with the common sense error that a happy life could be possible, He also can compromise with the common sense error that there could be some value to debate. For whatever reason, someone might need to get the better of someone else in a dispute. That is all that the dialectic is, by the way, for Schopenhauer. Winning. He has already laid aside the possibility that debate could lead us to the truth, for truth-seeking is a different kind of activity, and after all, man does not possess truth. If you accept this fact and you still want to win a debate, then Schopenhauer says he'll show you how to do it. He treats the art of debate like a fencing match, and just as the fencing instructor does not ask which of the two duelists is in the right, the teacher of dialectic must not concern himself with the truth. His only concern is with the tactics themselves, and he lists 38 of them, 38 ways of defeating your opponent. And he says that this knowledge is valuable for the dialectician and not necessarily solely because he wishes to use them himself. Quote, "Dialectic, in this sense of the word, has no other aim but to reduce to a regular system and collect and exhibit the arts which most men employ when they observe, in a dispute, that truth is not on their side, and still attempt to gain the day. Hence, it would be very inexpedient to pay any regard to objective truth or its advancement in a science of dialectic, since this is not done in that original and natural dialectic innate in men, where they strive for nothing but victory. The science of dialectic, in one sense of the word, is mainly concerned to tabulate and analyze dishonest stratagems, in order that in a real debate they may be at once recognized and defeated. It is for this very reason that dialectic must admittedly take victory and not objective truth for its aim and purpose." End quote. In other words, even if you don't intend to argue dishonestly yourself, it's incredibly important that you understand the dishonest tactics that are deployed in almost every debate, so that you can counter them. We're going to look at a selection of these 38 techniques today. I've picked out some of my favorites and the ones I think are most common. But before we get into that, there's something else that's really important for us to understand in the modern day, and that's data breaches. You can't really feel secure about your data unless you know for a fact that it hasn't been compromised. But when there's a data breach, it takes most companies an average of about 9 months to report that breach to the public. This is more common than you might think. Last year, Citigroup and JP Morgan Chase both had data breaches, and when Bank of America had a data breach recently, once again, the public didn't know about it for months. If being in the dark about your data being stolen sounds like something you want to avoid, then you should check out the sponsor for this video, Aura. Data brokers compile your private information and sell it to the highest bidder, all without your knowledge. Legally, they are supposed to remove it if you ask them, but they make it very hard to do. This is where Aura comes in. Aura will inform you if they find your data anywhere on the dark web, and will let you know quickly if anyone tries to use this information to try and get into your accounts. They will also do the hard work of removing your information from these data broker websites for you. Free credit monitoring after the fact, the kind of thing offered by other services. It's kind of like installing security cameras after your house was robbed. If you have Aura on your side, they'll be actively on the lookout to protect your data before anything happens. And in the worst case scenario, they offer up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. Their app provides so many features to keep you safe and informed about your data, and if you go right now to aura.com/essentialsalts, they'll even give you a free 14-day trial. Within that 14-day period, they can tell you if any of your personal data is exposed. You'll know about it before one of these companies are forced to notify you months later. So don't take any chances with your data. Don't let anyone take advantage of you because you were in the dark. Go to the sponsored link, get your free 14-day trial, and let Aura keep you in the know. And now back to the video. We'll begin with number 1, quote, "The extension. This consists in carrying your opponent's proposition beyond its natural limits, and giving it as general a signification and as wide a sense as possible, so as to exaggerate it, and on the other hand, in giving your own proposition as restricted a sense and as narrow limits as you can, because the more general a statement becomes, the more numerous are the objections to which it is open." End quote. In the dialectic, it is to your advantage to make your own claims narrow enough that they cannot include propositions that could be problematic. Thus, it is also to your advantage to make your opponent's claims as generalized as possible. One defense against this is to reestablish your claim by insisting on a narrower framework. This first tactic is related to tactic number 17, quote, If your opponent presses you with a counterproof, you will often be able to save yourself by advancing some subtle distinction, which, it is true, had not previously occurred to you. That is, if the matter admits of a double application or of being taken in any ambiguous sense." End quote. Thus, it may be to your advantage to make your claims just ambiguous enough that this could be an option for you. Then, if you've gotten yourself into trouble by advancing a proposition that your opponent could draw some unwanted conclusions from, be ready to improvise. Think up some way in which your opponent's generalization can't possibly apply to your argument. Schopenhauer gives his own examples throughout the text, but throughout this video I'll be including some examples as I see them in modern discourse, particularly political discourse. For an example of this tactic, we might imagine a debate in which one interlocutor argues, "The working class greatly benefited from my party's policies." His opponent counters, "Your party gutted the teachers' union." In response, the first interlocutor says, "Teachers are not part of the working class." Maybe the first interlocutor didn't even think of this distinction before hearing his opponent's objection. But now that he's heard it, he sees an easy weak point. Teachers aren't in the same class as manual laborers, men who work with their hands. They're part of an educated professional class. Schopenhauer gives his own example of the extension and a defense against it. An interlocutor counters Schopenhauer's claim that the English are the best in the art of drama. His argument is that the English are lacking when it comes to musical compositions and opera, to which Schopenhauer replies that those things have nothing to do with drama. He insists on the narrow interpretation of his claim, as applying only to drama itself. So this maneuvering will occur throughout the debate, trying to extend your opponent's argument to find problems or contradictions, and trying to insist on the specificity of your own positions. Let's look at the second tactic, quote. 2. The homonymy. This trick is to extend a proposition to something which has little or nothing in common with the matter in question, but the similarity of the word, then to refute it triumphantly, and so claim credit for having refuted the original statement, end quote. This is a variation on the first theme, but with a more devious aspect. The illogic of this kind of extension is fairly obvious with a bit of critical examination. I would say that we most frequently encounter this type of tactic when it comes to sloganeering or political oratory. For example, we could imagine a politician who asserts, "We are told that we live in the land of the free, and yet we still do not have free healthcare or free college." Freedom, in the sense of the phrase "the land of the free," was classically understood as pertaining to negative rights, freedom from tyranny or theocracy. Whereas the word free, when applied to healthcare or college, refers to receiving something without paying a cost for it, which is a fundamentally different concept. Thus, one refutes the claim that America is the land of the free because certain services are not rendered for free, conflating two very different things because the same word is used for both. The fourth tactic doesn't lay out a specific kind of argument, but is rather general advice for how to proceed in an argument. As such, if I were to quibble with Schopenhauer, it should really be called a stratagem rather than a tactic, but I digress. Schopenhauer writes, quote, "If you want to draw a conclusion, you must not let it be foreseen, but you must get the premises admitted one by one unobserved, mingling them here and there in your talk. Otherwise, your opponent will attempt all sorts of mischief. Or, if it is doubtful whether your opponent will admit them, you must advance the premises of these premises. That is to say, you must draw up pro-syllogisms and get the premises of several of them admitted in no definite order. In this way, you conceal your game until you have obtained all the admissions that are necessary, and so reach your goal by making a circuit." End quote. Socrates was practically famous for this kind of strategy, which we might call the concealment of one's conclusion. For one example, we could think of his dialogues in the Republic, in which he gets his interlocutors to concede that influencing people to emotional outbursts such as grief or madness would be detrimental to society. Then he gets them to agree to the idea that, therefore, music and poetry should only be heard by one for whom it is appropriate. Finally, he brings them around to the conclusion that in the ideal republic, art and poetry must be regulated. But the consequences of this are that the works of Homer and Hesiod, two beloved writers of ancient Greece, must therefore be censored. because they present the gods as irrational, given to anger or jealousy, and generally as unvirtuous. Schopenhauer might say that Socrates did well not to start off by suggesting that two of the most famous and beloved playwrights ought to be censored. The obvious benefit of this strategy is that one's opponent may agree to premises that he might have otherwise attacked if you had presented the conclusion immediately as a consequence of said premises. Instead, you place your opponent in the position of having to argue within the premises he's agreed to, or to contradict himself and therefore look bad. Your opponent could still argue that the conclusion you presented doesn't follow from the premises or is in contradiction with some other principles you've advanced. But the attack on the premises themselves is now denied to him without harming his own credibility. The 10th tactic is related to this fourth one, by the way. Quote, if you observe that your opponent designedly returns a negative answer to the questions which, for the sake of your proposition, you want him to answer in the affirmative, you must ask the converse of the proposition, as though it were that which you were anxious to see affirmed. Or, at any rate, you may give him his choice of both, so that he may not perceive which of them you are asking him to affirm. End quote. This is an even sneakier way of going about this, tricking your opponent into affirming the premises you want him to by making it appear as though you'd prefer him to reject those premises. I would argue, however, that this is likely going to be a difficult technique. That is, unless you're a skilled actor or some kind of sociopath for whom this kind of dissembling comes naturally. And we should also consider the 11th technique as well. Quote, if you make an induction and your opponent grants you the particular cases by which it is to be supported, you must refrain from asking him if he also admits the general truth which issues from the particulars, but introduce it afterwards as a settled and admitted fact. End quote. In other words, if you pull this off, if you get your opponent to agree to every premise of the syllogism, don't also ask your opponent to agree to the conclusion. Simply present it as the obvious consequences of what he's already said. For example, we might imagine getting our interlocutor to accede to a number of premises in which he extols the value of human life, say to oppose the death penalty or to oppose war, only to turn about and declare that naturally they must also agree with the pro-life cause. Of course, by its very nature, this won't be as effective in a debate directly on the subject of pro-life versus pro-choice. It may be that you lead your opponent to this conclusion as part of a broader debate about which national values we ought to hold. The only defense against this stratagem is to carefully consider what the ramifications are of each premise your opponent presents. Rather than letting yourself agree or disagree based on either your understanding of the objective truth or your read on what your opponent wants you to say, you should be incredibly hesitant to affirm or reject his propositions until you can be sure of the conclusion to which he is attempting to lead you. A good counter to this, therefore, would be to pose a series of clarifying questions in response, while giving your own non-committal answers wherever they are demanded. In other words, give yourself time to think and to assess where the argument is going, and get your opponent to further expose his intentions wherever possible. Of course, even if you properly defend yourself in this way, you should be prepared for tactic number 14. Quote, this, which is an impudent trick, is played as follows. When your opponent has answered several of your questions without the answers turning out favorable to the conclusion at which you are aiming, advance the desired conclusion, although it does not in the least follow, as though it had been proved, and proclaim it in a tone of triumph. If your opponent is shy or stupid, and you yourself possess a great deal of impudence and a good voice, the trick may easily succeed. End quote. In other words, just claim victory. Claim that your opponent has proved your own argument even when they haven't. I've seen this tactic employed on Reddit more times than I can count. But Schopenhauer is clearly thinking of a verbal debate here, and he argues, I think rightly, if you do this forcefully and stubbornly enough, and with good oratorical skill, you will succeed in absentia of logic. The only real defense against this is either to possess equal and opposite oratorical skill, or again, to pay very close attention to what the consequences of your opponent's premises are, and your own. Schopenhauer says that the most frequently used of these tactics is the 12th one. Quote, if the conversation turns upon some general conception which has no particular name, but requires some figurative or metaphorical designation, you must begin by choosing a metaphor that is favorable to your proposition. For instance, the names used to denote the two political parties in Spain, Serviles and Liberates, are obviously chosen by the latter. The name Protestants is chosen by themselves, and also the name evangelicals, but the Catholics call them heretics. What an impartial man with no further purpose to serve would call public worship or a system of religion is described by an adherent as piety, godliness, and by an opponent as bigotry, superstition. This is, at bottom, a subtle petitio principii. What is sought to be proved is, first of all, inserted in the definition, whence it is then taken by mere analysis. What one man calls placing in safe custody, another calls throwing into prison. A speaker often betrays his purpose beforehand by the names which he gives to things. Of all the tricks of controversy, this is the most frequent, and it is used instinctively. You hear of religious zeal or fanaticism, a faux pas, a piece of gallantry, or adultery, an equivocal or a bawdy story, embarrassment or bankruptcy, through influence and connection, or by bribery and nepotism, sincere gratitude, or good pay, end quote. This tactic is used most frequently precisely because of its instinctive nature. I'm sure you're all familiar with the meme, in which on one side we have our blessed homeland, and on the other side we have their barbarous wastes. The simple fact of the matter is that we use names to valorize the groups and identities that we're a part of and to denigrate enemy groups. It comes naturally to human beings because most people don't even mean to do this as a conscious dialectical technique. They express a politically charged schema of names because it reflects their valuations. But as Schopenhauer points out, we can observe how this process works and attempt to do so consciously. We've seen this time and again in political debates. One of the more popular topics a few decades ago was the pivot from the term global warming to climate change. Today, one can tell where one stands on the issue by whether they speak of illegal immigrants or, say, asylum seekers. On a more vulgar level, we might also think of the attempts to frame opponents as fascists or communists. Effectively, the names we use evoke emotions and provide a subtle, or sometimes not so subtle, statement of who the good guys and bad guys are. Names can therefore be an important way of shaping the Overton window. By christening one's opponent with a name that is inherently evil, you place them outside of that Overton window. Schopenhauer elaborates for the possibilities of this in a later tactic, number 32. Quote, "If you are confronted with an assertion, there is a short way of getting rid of it, or at any rate of throwing suspicion on it, by putting it into some odious category, even though the connection is only apparent or else of a loose character. You can say, for instance, that is Manichaeism, or it is Arianism, or Pelagianism, or Idealism, or Spinozism, or Pantheism, or Brownianism, or Naturalism, or Atheism, or Rationalism, Spiritualism, Mysticism, and so on." End quote. Some of these smears are a bit out of date today, but I think it's pretty easy to see the point of what Schopenhauer is saying here, and I don't know that there is a foolproof defense against this tactic. Rather, each party will be continuously maneuvering throughout the debate in order to achieve the framing that they favor. This means that the names and terms must remain in dispute throughout the dialectic. To drop this issue and let your opponent frame the debate in his terms, according to the names he would choose to use, will almost certainly lose you the debate. When Mehdi Hassan, for example, debated on Jubilee and attempted to frame his opponent as a fascist, his opponent miscalculated by accepting that definition. He ended up accepting a framing that looked really bad to most of the audience. Number 18 is particularly devious, but I'm sure you would all recognize it. Changing the subject. Quote, "If you observe that your opponent has taken up a line of argument which will end in your defeat, you must not allow him to carry it to its conclusion, but interrupt the course of the dispute in time, or break it off altogether, or lead him away from the subject and bring him to others." End quote. This is very common in cable news debates. Sometimes it takes the form of whataboutism, but I want to make it clear that this technique is not reducible to whataboutism. Some whatabouts can take the form of the tactic of extension, for example, expanding your opponent's claims to cover cases that are problematic for his point, showing his position to be self-contradictory. But one can also use a whataboutism to completely change the subject. For example, we could imagine someone concluding a data-driven argument by arguing that there have been more instances of, say, Republican elected officials violating the rule of law in recent years. For example, doing things which are unconstitutional or something of the like. And let's say for the sake of argument that the statistics are actually on their side. Let's say it's even incontrovertible. Well, their opponent could just change the subject and say, don't act as if you're the party of law and order when you celebrated the rioting in 2020. This shifts the conversation to a completely different subject because the point being made doesn't have to do with instances of rioting, nor even with who ought to be considered the party of law and order. It's an evasion of the specific narrow point about respect for law within government institutions among elected officials. The 19th tactic is a particularly good example of the satirical nature of Schopenhauer's work, when it comes to this essay anyway. We can see how he is being somewhat tongue-in-cheek and poking fun at some of the tropes of debate. Quote, should your opponent expressly challenge you to produce any objection to some definite point in his argument, and you have nothing much to say, you must try to give the matter a general turn, and then talk against that. If you are called upon to say why a particular physical hypothesis cannot be accepted, you may speak of the fallibility of human knowledge and give various illustrations of it. End quote. That last sentence of this section made me laugh out loud when I first read it. But once again, there's a real truth to Schopenhauer's observation here. When the particular case is not advantageous for your argument, you pivot to the generality. You might say something like, let's not lose the forest for the trees. To use a specific example, we might continue the previous hypothetical argument. The interlocutor simply says, are you seriously arguing that the Democrats are tougher on crime than Republicans? Something of the like. You reject whatever particular claims your opponent has presented, or rather ignore them, and simply express incredulity at the general overall point. That isn't really an argument, it's simply based on intuition, or based on the prejudicial assumptions of your own correctness. And while most audiences wouldn't be impressed if you begin waxing philosophical about the fallibility of human knowledge, we can easily imagine a situation in which your opponent presents you with a series of studies that prove his point, and you can simply say, I don't believe that we've done enough studies, or I don't trust the institutions that produce those studies. One of the fancier rhetorical flourishes that probably only works in certain circumstances is number 26. Quote, a brilliant move is the retorsio argumenti, or turning the tables, by which your opponent's argument is turned against himself. He declares, for instance, so-and-so is a child, you must make allowance for him. You retort, just because he is a child, I must correct him, otherwise he will persist in his bad habits. End quote. We could think of a common saying during the Iraq War in which the supporters of the war often made proclamations that they supported our troops and demanded this from other Americans almost as a kind of catechism. One response from the anti-war crowd was to say, I do support our troops, and that's why I want them to come home. The first slogan intends to equate support of the troops with support of the current administration's military objectives, and the response equates supporting the troops with defying the current administration's objectives. Number 27 is probably the most common one I see online, and I think the frequency is again tied to a kind of instinctual behavior. It's not always consciously employed. Quote, should your opponent surprise you by becoming particularly angry at an argument, you must urge it with all the more zeal, not only because it is a good thing to make him angry, but because it may be presumed that you have here put your finger on the weak side of his case, and that just here he is more open to attack than even for the moment you perceive. End quote. This is the majority of online debates. You mad bro, cope, seethe, L, etc. These are completely empty rhetorical statements designed solely to irritate and anger the opponent. But the fact of the matter is, the calmer interlocutor almost always ends up the better for it in the eyes of the audience. Calmness reads as objectivity, and so regardless of whether or not the objective truth is on your side, it behooves you not to get angry. Therefore, it is to your great advantage to try and make your opponent angry in any way that you can, and that is actually one of Schopenhauer's earlier tactics, number 7. There, he says, quote, this trick consists in making your opponent angry. For when he is angry, he is incapable of judging aright, and perceiving where his advantage lies. You can make him angry by doing him repeated injustice or practicing some kind of mischief and being generally insolent. End quote. In other words, it is good in and of itself to anger your opponent, because it will make him worse at debating, But if your opponent becomes suddenly or unexpectedly angry, you should persist in whatever point you are pressing at that moment. Press into the sore spot like a bruise. The defense against this is to, well, don't get angry. But this is a discipline issue, and it might not be possible for everyone. And yet again, it's why many sociopathic personality types, people like Destiny for example, become really good at debate. Anger isn't the only sign that you're getting somewhere, by the way. Another one is evasion. Schopenhauer brings this up in number 34, quote, "When you state a question or an argument and your opponent gives you no direct answer or reply, but evades it by a counter-question or an indirect answer or some assertion which has no bearing on the matter and generally tries to turn the subject, it is a sure sign that you have touched a weak spot, sometimes without knowing it. You have, as it were, reduced him to silence. You must therefore urge the point all the more, and not let your opponent evade it, even when you do not know where the weakness which you have hit upon really lies." End quote. Earlier, I suggested asking clarifying questions of your own and giving non-committal answers. But if your opponent starts doing this, this is precisely where you have to remain laser-focused. Recognize when a diversion is being practiced or a red herring being offered. Continue to pose the same question again and again as long as your opponent hasn't answered it. A common rhetorical move at this point is to start gloating and say that he, quote, can't answer your question. There are some tactics that can be best employed when one is in a position of authority, especially when they have the respect or admiration of the audience. See number 31, quote, "If you know that you have no reply to the arguments which your opponent advances, you may, by a fine stroke of irony, declare yourself to be an incompetent judge. What you now say passes my poor powers of comprehension. It may be all very true, but I can't understand it, and I refrain from any expression of opinion on it." In this way, you insinuate to the bystanders, with whom you are in good repute, that what your opponent says is nonsense. Thus, when Kant's critique appeared, or rather when it began to make a noise in the world, many professors of the old eclectic school declared that they failed to understand it, in the belief that their failure settled the business. But when the adherents of the new school proved to them that they were quite right and had really failed to understand it, they were in a very bad humor. This is a trick which may be used only when you are quite sure that the audience thinks much better of you than of your opponent. A professor, for instance, may try it on a student." End quote. This is pretty standard stuff, honestly. In the modern context, we could imagine someone simply dismissing a complex philosophical argument out of hand by calling it a wall of text. I'm not going to read all that. But Schopenhauer's insight is that this only works if you're already in the position of respect or authority. If you're a rebel or a challenger, this kind of attitude will simply make you look ignorant. It's the fact that we trust or like the person who takes this dismissive attitude that leads us to believe that their opponent must simply be talking nonsense. If you are in the position of rebel or challenger, there are some cases in which one's expertise or authority can be used against them, supposing that the audience doesn't have that same level of understanding. See, for example, number 27, quote, "This is chiefly practicable in a dispute between scholars in the presence of the unlearned. You can start some invalid objection, which, however, only an expert sees to be invalid. Now, your opponent is an expert, but those who form your audience are not, and accordingly, in their eyes, he is defeated, particularly if the objection which you make places him in any ridiculous light. People are ready to laugh, and you have the laughers on your side." End quote. I've definitely seen this kind of thing go on in flat earth debates. In this case, the only real defense is to be prepared to explain your arguments in a way that lay people can understand. Or, if you're an expert, simply refuse to debate non-experts or demagogues, especially in front of an audience. But this can be difficult. One of the most effective tactics that Schopenhauer presents is number 35. Quote, "There is another trick which, as soon as it is practicable, makes all others unnecessary. Instead of working on your opponent's intellect by argument, work on his will by motive, and he, and also the audience, if they have similar interests, will at once be won over to your opinion, even though you got it out of a lunatic asylum. For, as a general rule, half an ounce of will is more effective than 100 weight of insight and intelligence. This, it is true, can be done only under peculiar circumstances. If you succeed in making your opponent feel that his opinion, should it prove true, will be distinctly prejudicial to his interest, he will let it drop like a hot potato and feel that it was very imprudent to take it up. A clergyman, for instance, is defending some philosophical dogma. You make him sensible of the fact that it is in immediate contradiction with one of the fundamental doctrines of his church, and he abandons it. A landed proprietor maintains that the use of machinery in agricultural operations as practiced in England is an excellent institution, since an engine does the work of many men. You give him to understand that it will not be very long before carriages are also worked by steam, and that the value of his large stud will be greatly depreciated, and you will see what he will say." End quote. This is one of the more illuminating sections as regards Schopenhauer's own philosophy, and how that interacts with his advice in The Art of Being Right. In truth, logic is not the active force in debate, but competing selfish wills. If you understand what your opponent really wants, what his will is aimed at, not only will you become better at defeating his arguments, you might even be able to persuade him. But persuasion doesn't happen according to pure logic. You have to sidestep the intellect and appeal to people's motivations, and you'll be far more persuasive. Perhaps a good example would be the advertising philosophy of Edward Bernays. His technique was to speak to the subconscious desires of the public rather than their reason. This has formed the basis of most advertising strategies even today. Before we conclude today, we have to talk about the final tactic, for even though it's a very common one, very easy to understand, requires almost no explanation, Schopenhauer rightly presents it as a powerful technique that can be used as a last resort. If all else fails, quote, "A last trick is to become personal, insulting, rude, as soon as you perceive that your opponent has the upper hand and that you are going to come off worst. It consists in passing from the subject of dispute, as from a lost game, to the disputant himself, and in some way attacking his person. You leave the subject altogether and turn your attack to his person by remarks of an offensive and spiteful character. This is a very popular trick because everyone is able to carry it into effect. And so it is of frequent application. Now the question is, what counter trick avails for the other party? For if he has recourse to the same rule, there will be blows or a duel or an action for slander. It would be a great mistake to suppose that it is sufficient not to become personal yourself. Nothing is of greater moment to a man than the gratification of his vanity, and no wound is more painful than that which is inflicted on it. Hence phrases such as death before dishonor, and so on. The gratification of vanity arises mainly by comparison of oneself with others in every respect, but chiefly in respect of one's intellectual powers. And so the most effective and the strongest gratification of it is to be found in controversy. Hence the embitterment of defeat, apart from any question of injustice, and hence recourse to that last weapon, that last trick, which you cannot evade by mere politeness. A cool demeanor may, however, help you here, if as soon as your opponent becomes personal, you quietly reply, "That has no bearing on the point in dispute," and immediately bring the conversation back to it, and continue to show him that he is wrong without taking any notice of his insults. Say, as Themistocles said to Eurybiades, "Strike, but hear me." But such demeanor is not given to everyone. End quote. It's rather obvious to point out that oftentimes online debates become a dumpster fire of personal insults and insinuations. But Schopenhauer would argue that's because it's a potent weapon in the dispute that anyone can use. By making insults, you wound your opponent's honor, his pride in his intellectual prowess. And while it's easy enough to say that you should just let it pass, usually this can make you look weak. If debate is a battle of wits and your opponent makes a witty put-down against you, you're somewhat expected to make a witty put-down of your own, or a riposte of some kind. True, this is to disregard the topic of the debate and make it personal, but that's the way it goes. The only way to not become insulting yourself is to again retain a cool demeanor with a laser focus, staying on the actual proposition being discussed. But not everyone has it in them to do this, and so we ought not expect that online debates would have this character. But perhaps this final observation, this final tactic, is the best argument available in favor of not getting involved in this debate business. Schopenhauer concludes his satirical treatise with some real advice. We could summarize it for modern audiences. Don't waste your time arguing with strangers on the internet. But Schopenhauer says this much more beautifully than I could, so we will conclude with his words. Quote, "The only safe rule, therefore, is that which Aristotle mentions in the last chapter of his Topica. not to dispute with the first person you meet, but only with those of your acquaintance, of whom you know that they possess sufficient intelligence and self-respect not to advance absurdities, to appeal to reason and not to authority, and to listen to reason and yield to it, and finally, to cherish truth, to be willing to accept reason even from an opponent, and to be just enough to bear being proved to be in the wrong, should truth lie with him. From this it follows that scarcely one man in 100 is worth your disputing with him. You may let the remainder say what they please, for everyone is at liberty to be a fool. Remember what Voltaire says, peace is even better than truth. Remember also an Arabian proverb, which tells us that on the tree of silence there hangs its fruit, which is peace. End quote. Thank you for joining me, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.